Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the stories I bring here are not the kind you'll find anywhere else. I spend weeks researching these cases, talking to real people, digging through documents and records that most folks never get to see. And today, I need you to stay with me until the very end. I'm not exaggerating when I say this story kept me awake for 3 straight nights. There's something about it that just doesn't let go. So grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Before I start, I want to give you a heads up about what we're dealing with today. This story involves illegal animal trafficking, survival against impossible odds, and a reunion that honestly I still can't fully explain. I've covered a lot of strange cases on this channel, but this one hits different. It's the kind of story that makes you question what animals really understand about us. And I'll be honest with you, when I first heard about it, I thought someone was making it up. But then I started digging, and everything checked out. The man at the center of this story is a wildlife veterinarian named Marcus Reed. At the time this all started, he was 34 years old, working for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Marcus wasn't the kind of guy who looked for attention or dramatic moments. He was just a professional doing his job in one of the most unforgiving environments in the country. But in January of 2019, something happened that would change his life in ways he never expected, and I got the chance to speak with him directly about what went down. Now, I need you to pay close attention to the details as I tell this story. Some things might seem small or unimportant at first, but trust me, they're going to matter later. This is one of those cases where everything connects, and if you miss a piece, the ending won't hit the same way. I've structured this video in parts so you can follow along without getting lost. Each part builds on the last, and by the end, you'll understand why I couldn't stop thinking about this. What makes this story so unusual is the animal involved. We're not talking about a stray dog or an injured deer. We're talking about a white tiger cub found freezing to death in the mountains of Montana. And if you know anything about wildlife, you know that makes absolutely no sense. White tigers don't exist in the American wilderness. They're not native here, they don't migrate here, and they certainly don't just appear in the middle of a snowstorm. So the first question Marcus had to answer was simple but disturbing. How did this animal get here? The answer to that question leads us into a dark world that most people don't even know exists. Illegal exotic animal trade is a massive industry, and it operates right here in the United States. People buy tigers, lions, and other big cats like they're purchasing furniture online. And when things go wrong, when the money runs out, or the authorities get too close, these animals get abandoned, left to die in places where they have no chance of survival. That's the reality behind this story, and it's something I think more people need to understand. But here's where things get truly strange. What started as a rescue mission in 2019 didn't end there. 4 years later, Marcus found himself in a life-threatening situation in those same mountains. And what happened next? Well, I'll let the story speak for itself. I don't want to spoil it, but I will say this. By the time you reach the end of this video, you're going to have a lot of questions about what animals remember and what they're capable of feeling. I certainly did. So with all that said, let's go back to where it all began. It was a freezing night in January of 2019. The temperature had dropped to negative 20 degrees, and a massive snowstorm was tearing through the Montana mountains. Most people were inside, safe and warm, waiting for it to pass. But Marcus Reed was out there, driving through near-zero visibility, responding to an emergency call about animals in distress. He had no idea that in a few hours he would find something that would haunt him for years. Let's get into it. January in Montana is not for the faint of heart. We're talking about a place where winter doesn't just arrive, it takes over completely. The mountains become isolated, roads disappear under feet of snow, and temperatures drop so low that exposed skin can get frostbite in minutes. This is the environment where Marcus Reed spent most of his working life. He knew the dangers better than anyone, and he respected them. But on that particular night, respect wasn't enough to keep him safe. The storm that hit on January 14th, 2019, was one of the worst the region had seen in years. Marcus was at the station when the call came in around 7 in the evening. A hiker had reported seeing what looked like animal tracks near an abandoned property up in the hills. Normally, this kind of call would wait until morning, until conditions improved. But the report mentioned something unusual. The tracks were large, too large for the typical wildlife in the area, and they seemed to lead toward a rocky outcrop where animals sometimes got trapped. Marcus made the decision to check it out. He told me later that he almost didn't go. Almost. The drive up the mountain was brutal from the start. Visibility dropped to nearly zero within the first 20 minutes. The snow was coming down so thick that the headlights just reflected white back at him. Marcus said it felt like driving into a wall. The road, if you could even call it that, was covered in ice and fresh powder. His truck slid twice before he even reached the halfway point. Any reasonable person would have turned around, but Marcus kept going. He had this feeling, he told me, that something was waiting for him up there. About an hour into the drive, his radio started cutting out. First it was just static, then complete silence. He tried switching channels, adjusting the antenna. Nothing worked. Now he was completely alone. No communication with the station. No way to call for backup if something went wrong. This is the part where most people would definitely turn back, and Marcus considered it. He sat there in his truck, engine running, staring into the white void ahead of him. He thought about his warm apartment, his dog waiting at home, the cup of coffee he'd left half-finished on his desk. Marcus told me something during our conversation that stuck with me. He said that in that moment, sitting in his truck with the storm raging outside, he felt like the universe was testing him, like there was a choice being presented, and whatever he decided would matter. It sounds dramatic, I know, but when you hear the rest of this story, you'll understand why he felt that way. He took a deep breath, put the truck back in gear, and kept driving. That decision, that single moment of pushing forward instead of turning back, changed everything. The temperature outside had dropped to negative 22 degrees. Marcus was wearing 3 layers under his heavy coat, and he was still cold. The heater in his truck was working overtime, but every time he opened the door to check the road conditions, the cold hit him like a physical force. He told me it felt like the air itself was trying to push him back, like nature was warning him to stay away. But Marcus had been doing this job for nearly a decade. He'd seen bad storms before. He thought he knew what he was dealing with. He was wrong. By the time he reached the area where the tracks had been reported, it was almost 10 at night. 3 hours of driving through hell, and he still couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him. The storm showed no signs of letting up. Marcus parked the truck and sat there for a moment, listening to the wind howling outside. He checked his gear: flashlight, first aid kit, thermal blanket, tranquilizer gun, just in case. He had no idea what he was about to find, but he wanted to be ready for anything, or at least that's what he thought. Marcus told me that he almost turned back that night, almost got back in his truck and drove home to safety. If he had made that choice, this story wouldn't exist. The animal he was about to find would have died alone in the cold, and their paths would never have crossed again. But Marcus didn't turn back. He stepped out of his truck, pulled his hood tight against the wind, and started walking into the storm. And that's when everything changed. What he found out there in the darkness, just a few hundred yards from his truck, would haunt him for years to come. But that's the next part of our story. Marcus had been walking for maybe 10 minutes when he saw the first set of tracks. Even in the chaos of the storm, with snow blowing everywhere and visibility almost gone, those prints stood out. They were pressed deep into the snow, which meant whatever made them was heavy. His first thought was mountain lion. Pumas are common in that region, and they're known to roam during storms when prey is vulnerable. But as he crouched down to examine the prints more closely, something didn't add up. The shape was wrong. The spacing between the toes, the size of the pad, it didn't match any puma track he'd ever seen. And he'd seen hundreds. The tracks were too big for a lynx, that was obvious. But they were also too round for a wolf, and wolves don't typically travel alone in that area anyway. Marcus stood there in the freezing wind, flashlight in hand, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. He told me that for a moment he thought maybe he was seeing things. Maybe the cold and the exhaustion were playing tricks on his mind. But the tracks were real. They were clear, and they led deeper into the darkness toward a rocky formation about 200 yards ahead. He followed the trail carefully, one step at a time. The wind was so loud that he couldn't hear anything else. No animal sounds, no rustling, nothing but the constant roar of the storm. Marcus kept his tranquilizer gun ready, just in case. He had no idea what he was walking toward, and in conditions like these, surprises could be deadly. The tracks continued in a straight line, which was unusual. Most animals wander, they zigzag, they follow scent trails. But these prints moved with purpose, like whatever made them knew exactly where it was going, or like it was running from something. When Marcus reached the rock formation, he almost missed it. The entrance to a small natural shelter was half covered with snow, barely visible in the beam of his flashlight. But the tracks led directly inside, and they didn't come back out. Whatever had made those prints was still in there. Marcus took a deep breath and crouched down to look inside. What he saw made him freeze completely. Curled up against the back wall, barely moving, was a small white shape. At first, his brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. It looked like a cat, but the size was wrong. Too big for a house cat, too small for anything that should be out here. He crawled closer, and that's when reality hit him. It was a tiger cub, a white tiger cub, maybe 4 or 5 months old, with pale blue eyes that were barely open. The animal was shaking violently, its breathing shallow and labored. Frost had formed on its whiskers and around its nose. Marcus told me that in that moment, his training completely took over. He didn't stop to question how or why this animal was here. He just knew it was dying, and he had maybe minutes to change that outcome. Everything else could wait. Now, I need you to understand something important here. White tigers do not exist in the wild in America. They're not native to this continent. They don't migrate here. There is absolutely no natural explanation for a white tiger cub to be freezing to death in the mountains of Montana. These animals only exist in captivity, in zoos, in private collections, and unfortunately, in the illegal exotic animal trade. So while Marcus was focused on saving this cub's life, a much darker question was already forming in the back of his mind. Someone had put this animal here. Someone had brought it to this place and left it to die. Marcus stripped off his outer coat and wrapped it around the cub as carefully as he could. The animal was so weak that it didn't even resist. That's a bad sign with any wild cat, even a young one. Their instinct is to fight, to scratch, to protect themselves. But this cub just lay there, trembling, barely conscious. Marcus held it against his chest, trying to transfer as much body heat as possible. He could feel the cub's heart beating, fast and irregular, struggling to keep the small body alive. He knew he had to get back to the truck immediately. Every second counted. The walk back to the truck felt like it took forever. Marcus was carrying the cub under his jacket, pressed against his body, while fighting through the same brutal storm that had almost made him turn back earlier. His hands were numb, his face was burning from the cold, and he couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. But he kept moving. He told me that he talked to the cub the entire way, just nonsense words, reassurances, anything to keep himself focused. He didn't know if the animal could hear him or understand him. He just knew that he wasn't going to let it die. Not out here. Not like this. The moment Marcus got back to his truck, he cranked the heater to maximum and placed the cub on the passenger seat, still wrapped in his coat. The animal hadn't moved or made a sound during the entire walk back. That terrified him more than anything else. A healthy tiger cub, even a young one, would show some sign of life, some resistance, some instinct to fight. But this one just lay there, a small bundle of white fur that was barely breathing. Marcus checked for a pulse and found it weak and thready. He knew he was running out of time. The nearest emergency veterinary center was 45 minutes away, and that was under normal conditions. In this storm, it could take twice as long. He started driving immediately, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the cub to monitor its breathing. The roads were even worse now than when he'd come up. The snow had piled higher, and the wind was pushing the truck sideways with every strong gust. Marcus told me he drove faster than he should have, taking risks he normally never would. But every time he looked at that small white shape on the seat next to him, he pressed the accelerator a little harder. He called ahead to the veterinary center using his personal cell phone, since the radio was still dead. They told him to come straight in, that they'd have a team ready. The drive took almost an hour and 20 minutes. By the time Marcus pulled into the emergency center, his hands were cramping from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. He carried the cub inside, and the team took over immediately. They started warming protocols, IV fluids, oxygen support, everything they could do to stabilize the animal. Marcus stood in the corner of the room, watching, still wearing his snow-covered clothes, shivering from the cold he hadn't even noticed until now. A nurse brought him coffee and a blanket, but he barely registered either. His eyes never left the small white form on the examination table. The first 12 hours were critical. The cub's body temperature was dangerously low, and there was concern about organ damage from prolonged hypothermia. Twice during that first night, the monitors started alarming, and the team had to intervene to keep the animal alive. Marcus told me he didn't sleep at all. He just sat in a chair in the corner watching, waiting, hoping. He wasn't even supposed to be there, technically. His job was done the moment he delivered the animal to the center, but something kept him in that room. Something he couldn't explain, and honestly, something I don't think he fully understands even now. Marcus showed me the photos from that night during our conversation. The cub was so small it could fit in both of his hands. Its eyes were closed, its body limp, its fur matted with melted snow and frost. The breathing was so faint that Marcus said he checked every 2 minutes to make sure the animal was still alive. Looking at those images, it's hard to believe this was the same creature that would later grow into a 400-pound adult tiger. In that moment, it was just a baby, helpless and abandoned, fighting for survival against odds that should have been impossible. By the second day, the cub started showing small signs of improvement. Its temperature was stabilizing, its breathing was stronger, and at one point, it opened its eyes for a few seconds. Marcus happened to be right there when it happened. He told me the cub looked directly at him, just for a moment, before closing its eyes again. He knows it probably doesn't mean anything. Animals don't form connections like that, not so quickly, not in those conditions. But he said he felt something in that moment, a recognition of some kind. He laughed when he told me this, said he knows how crazy it sounds, but I could tell he meant it. For the next 72 hours, Marcus barely left the veterinary center. He went home once to shower and feed his dog, then came right back. The staff started joking that he should just move in permanently, but Marcus couldn't stay away. He felt responsible for this animal in a way he'd never experienced before with any of the hundreds of creatures he'd helped during his career. Maybe it was the circumstances of the rescue, the storm, the impossible discovery. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Either way, a bond was forming, even if Marcus wasn't ready to admit it yet. The cub made it through the critical period. Against all odds, against everything working against it, this small white tiger survived. The veterinary team called it a miracle, and honestly, that's not an exaggeration. By the end of the first week, the cub was eating on its own, moving around its enclosure, and showing the first signs of the playful, curious personality that would define it in the months to come. Marcus was there for all of it. But even as he celebrated the cub's recovery, darker questions were demanding answers. Where had this animal come from? Who had abandoned it in those mountains? And what was going to happen to it now? While the cub was fighting for its life at the veterinary center, a parallel investigation was already underway. The moment Marcus reported finding a white tiger in the Montana wilderness, alarm bells started ringing across multiple agencies. This wasn't just an unusual animal rescue. This was evidence of a serious crime. Federal wildlife officers, state police, and the Montana Department of Justice all got involved within the first 48 hours. Someone had brought an exotic animal into the state illegally, and that someone needed to be found. Marcus cooperated fully, providing exact coordinates, photographs, and detailed descriptions of everything he'd observed that night. The investigation moved quickly. Officers started canvassing the area where Marcus had found the cub, looking for any signs of how it got there. What they discovered was disturbing. About 3 miles from the rock formation where the cub had been hiding, investigators found an abandoned property that had been completely cleared out. The buildings were empty, but the evidence left behind told a horrifying story. Large animal cages, industrial-grade feeding equipment, and waste consistent with big cats. This wasn't someone's misguided attempt to keep an exotic pet. This was a full-scale, illegal operation. The property, it turned out, had been operating as an unlicensed private zoo for at least 2 years. Local authorities had received complaints before, but the remote location and the property owner's connections had kept serious investigations at bay. That changed when the FBI got involved. Financial records showed that the operation was connected to a larger network trafficking exotic animals across state lines. Tigers, lions, leopards, and other big cats were being bred, sold, and traded like commodities. And when the heat got too close, the people running it simply vanished, leaving everything behind. What they left behind included more than just empty cages. In the weeks following the initial discovery, search teams found the remains of several animals in the surrounding wilderness. A young lion, dead from exposure. 2 leopard cubs that hadn't survived more than a few days in the cold. And evidence suggesting there had been at least 1 adult tiger on the property that was never recovered. The white tiger cub that Marcus found was likely one of several animals that either escaped or were deliberately released when the operation was abandoned. It was the only one that survived, the only one that someone happened to find in time. This is the part of the story that genuinely made me angry when I was researching it. These weren't wild animals that wandered into dangerous territory by accident. These were creatures that had been bred in captivity, kept in cages their entire lives, and then thrown away like garbage when they became inconvenient. The people running this operation didn't see them as living beings. They saw them as products, as inventory, as problems to be disposed of. Ghost, the cub that Marcus saved, was just a baby, maybe 5 months old at most, left alone in a freezing wilderness with no survival skills and no chance of making it on its own. The name Ghost came naturally. Marcus didn't plan it or think about it too carefully. It just fit. The cub was white as snow, almost invisible in the blizzard that night. And more importantly, it had come back from the dead. By all logic and probability, that animal should have died in those mountains. The cold, the isolation, the lack of food or shelter, everything was stacked against it. But somehow, against all odds, it survived long enough for Marcus to find it. Ghost seemed like the only name that made sense, a small white phantom that refused to disappear. The investigation continued for months after the initial discovery. Several arrests were eventually made, though the main operators of the trafficking network were never caught. They had too much warning, too many resources, and too many places to hide. The property was seized, the remaining evidence catalogued, and the case files were added to a growing database of exotic animal trafficking in the United States. It was a small victory, but it didn't feel like enough. Not when you think about all the animals that didn't make it. Not when you know that operations like this are still running right now in dozens of states, with thousands of animals suffering the same fate. But this story isn't about the criminals who got away. It's about what happened next. Ghost was recovering, getting stronger every day, and soon a decision would have to be made about its future. Marcus had saved the cub's life, but he couldn't keep it. No private citizen in Montana can legally own a tiger, and even if they could, raising a big cat requires resources and expertise that most people simply don't have. Ghost needed a permanent home, a place where it could live safely for the rest of its life. And Marcus was about to learn just how hard it is to say goodbye to something you've fought so hard to save. The 3 months following the rescue were unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his career. As Ghost recovered and grew stronger, something unexpected started happening. The cub began recognizing Marcus in ways that went beyond normal animal behavior. Whenever Marcus entered the room, Ghost would immediately move toward the front of the enclosure. Its ears would perk up, its tail would twitch, and it would make a low rumbling sound that the veterinary staff had never heard it make with anyone else. At first, Marcus dismissed it as coincidence, as the cub simply associating him with food or attention, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Ghost responded to its name. Not every time, and not in the way a dog might, but enough to be noticeable. When Marcus called out Ghost from across the room, the cub would turn its head and look directly at him. The veterinary team started documenting this behavior because it was so unusual. Big cats in captivity don't typically form these kinds of individual attachments, especially not to humans they've only known for a few weeks. But Ghost seemed different. Whether it was because of the trauma of its early life, or the circumstances of its rescue, or something else entirely, this animal had formed a bond with the man who saved it. Marcus started visiting every day, even on his days off. He told himself it was just professional interest, just making sure the animal was progressing properly. But that wasn't the whole truth. He looked forward to those visits. He found himself talking to Ghost, telling it about his day, his problems, his thoughts about the future. The cub would sit and watch him, those pale blue eyes following his every movement. It felt like the animal was actually listening, actually understanding. Marcus knew that was probably just projection, just his human brain finding patterns where none existed. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two very different things. The reality of the situation couldn't be avoided forever. Ghost was growing rapidly. At 3 months post-rescue, the cub had already tripled in size and showed no signs of slowing down. Within a year, this would be a 200-pound predator with teeth and claws capable of killing an adult human. No matter how strong the bond between them felt, Marcus could not keep this animal. It wasn't legal, it wasn't safe, and most importantly, it wasn't fair to Ghost. The cub deserved a proper home, a place with space to roam, proper enrichment, and other big cats to socialize with. Marcus started researching sanctuaries. The facility that agreed to take Ghost was a well-respected big cat sanctuary with years of experience rehabilitating rescued exotic animals. They had the resources, the expertise, and the space that Ghost would need for the rest of its life. It was the right decision, the responsible decision, the only decision that made sense. Marcus knew all of this. He agreed with all of this. But that didn't make it any easier when the day finally came. He spent the entire morning before the transfer sitting with Ghost, talking quietly, trying to explain something to an animal that couldn't possibly understand, or maybe it could. At this point, Marcus wasn't sure of anything anymore. When the transport team arrived, Ghost seemed to sense that something was different. The cub became agitated, pacing in its enclosure, vocalizing in ways it hadn't before. Marcus helped with the transfer, staying calm and professional, even though his hands were shaking slightly. Ghost was sedated lightly for the journey, just enough to reduce stress, and loaded into a specialized transport crate. The whole process took less than 30 minutes. Months of daily visits, of conversations, of building something that felt meaningful, reduced to a clipboard of paperwork and a metal crate in the back of a truck. That's the part Marcus said he wasn't prepared for. Just before the truck pulled away, Marcus walked over to say goodbye. Ghost was awake, watching through the crate's ventilation slots. Their eyes met for what felt like a long time, but was probably only a few seconds. And then, as the transport team started moving the crate toward the vehicle, Ghost turned its head and looked back at Marcus one last time. Just a glance. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could prove meant anything at all. But Marcus saw it. He felt it. And he told me that in that moment he knew this wasn't really goodbye. He had no logical reason to believe that, but he knew it anyway. I asked Marcus if he cried when Ghost left. He went quiet for about 10 seconds, just staring at the floor. Then he said, "I couldn't go back to work for a week." I think that answers the question better than any words could. For Marcus, Ghost wasn't just another animal he'd rescued. It was something more, something he couldn't fully articulate and didn't expect anyone else to understand. He followed the sanctuary's updates religiously for the next few years, watching Ghost grow from a traumatized cub into a magnificent adult tiger. He thought about visiting, but never did. He told himself the cub had moved on, had a new life now, didn't need reminders of the past. He was wrong about that. Very wrong. 4 years passed. Ghost grew into a healthy adult tiger at the sanctuary, and Marcus continued his work with Montana fish, wildlife and parks. He checked the sanctuary's website occasionally, looking at photos of Ghost lounging in the sun or playing with enrichment toys. The cub he'd held against his chest in a freezing truck was now a 400-pound apex predator with striking white fur and those same pale blue eyes. Marcus was proud of the outcome, grateful that Ghost had survived and found a good home. But he'd accepted that their story was over. That chapter had closed, or so he thought. January 2023 would prove him completely wrong. The assignment was routine. A wolf pack in the same mountain region where Marcus had found Ghost 4 years earlier needed monitoring. Trackers had reported unusual movement patterns, and the department wanted ground verification before winter made the area completely inaccessible. Marcus volunteered immediately. He knew that terrain better than anyone, and despite the memories it held, he felt comfortable working there. The weather forecast showed a moderate storm approaching, but nothing he hadn't handled dozens of times before. He planned to be in and out within a single day. Plans, as it turns out, don't mean much in the Montana wilderness. The storm arrived faster and harder than predicted. By mid-afternoon, visibility had dropped to near zero, and Marcus made the decision to head back to his vehicle. That's when the accident happened. He was traversing a rocky slope when a patch of ice gave way beneath his boots. The fall wasn't far, maybe 15 feet into a shallow ravine, but he landed badly. His left ankle twisted with a sickening crack, and his radio smashed against a rock on the way down. Marcus lay there in the snow, pain shooting up his leg, staring at the broken pieces of his only communication device. In an instant, his situation had gone from manageable to potentially fatal. He tried to stand, tried to put weight on the injured ankle, but the pain was immediate and overwhelming, sprained at minimum, possibly fractured. Either way, he wasn't walking out of here on his own. Marcus crawled to a small overhang that provided minimal shelter from the wind and assessed his options. His truck was over 2 miles away, across terrain he couldn't navigate with one working leg. His radio was destroyed. His cell phone had no signal this deep in the mountains. The temperature was already dropping, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. He had a thermal blanket, some emergency supplies, and maybe 8 hours until hypothermia became a serious threat. The sun set around 5:30. By 6, the temperature had plummeted to negative 15 degrees, and Marcus was starting to feel the cold penetrating his layers despite the thermal blanket. He'd positioned himself as best he could, conserving energy, staying as warm as possible, but he knew the math wasn't in his favor. He'd been in difficult situations before, but nothing quite like this. Alone, injured, with no way to call for help, and a storm that could last another 12 hours. He told me that he started thinking about things he hadn't thought about in years. Regrets, missed opportunities, people he should have called more often. The kind of thoughts that come when you're genuinely unsure if you'll see morning. Around 9 at night, Marcus heard something, a sound in the darkness, barely audible over the wind. Footsteps, heavy ones crunching through the snow. Something large was moving toward his position. His first thought was mountain lion, who must sometimes hunt in storms, using the chaos and reduced visibility to their advantage. His second thought was bear, though that made less sense in January. Either way, injured and unable to run, Marcus knew he was in serious trouble. He reached for the small knife on his belt, not that it would do much against a large predator, and prepared himself for whatever was about to emerge from the white darkness ahead. What came out of the storm was impossible. A massive white shape, materializing from the snow like it had been born from it. Marcus's brain refused to process what his eyes were seeing. A tiger, a white tiger, fully grown, standing maybe 20 feet away and staring directly at him. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The animal's pale blue eyes caught what little light existed, reflecting an eerie glow. Marcus felt his heart pounding so hard he could hear it over the wind. A wild tiger, if you could even call it that, facing a wounded human in the middle of a blizzard. Every survival instinct he had was screaming at him to do something, anything. But he couldn't move. He could barely breathe. The tiger took a step closer, then another. Marcus gripped his knife tighter, knowing it was useless, knowing that if this animal wanted to kill him, there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. But then he noticed something. A small tag on the tiger's left ear, barely visible in the dim light. A sanctuary identification marker. His mind raced, trying to calculate the probability, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But the tag was there, and the eyes were the same pale blue he remembered, and the animal wasn't attacking. It was just standing there, looking at him with an expression that seemed almost confused, almost curious, almost like recognition. Marcus spoke without thinking. "Ghost!" His voice came out as barely a whisper, cracked and weak from the cold. The tiger's ears twitched. It took another step forward, then another, until it was close enough that Marcus could have reached out and touched it. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. And then Ghost did something that Marcus still can't fully explain without his voice breaking. The tiger lay down, right there, in the snow, less than 2 feet away from him. It positioned its massive body between Marcus and the worst of the wind, and it stayed there, 400 pounds of muscle and fur and warmth, acting as a living barrier against the cold that was slowly killing him. Marcus didn't sleep that night, but he survived it. The warmth radiating from Ghost's body was enough to keep his core temperature stable through the worst hours. He lay there in the darkness, listening to the tiger's steady breathing, feeling the rise and fall of its chest, wondering if he was hallucinating or dreaming or already dead. When dawn finally came and the storm began to break, Marcus heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors. Search and rescue had been deployed when he missed his check-in. By the time the team reached his position, Ghost was gone, vanished back into the wilderness as silently as it had appeared. The rescuers found Marcus alone, hypothermic but alive, with large paw prints in the snow all around him. I know what you're thinking right now. I thought the same thing when I first heard this story. It sounds like fiction, like something someone made up for attention or clicks. But I did my research. I saw Marcus's medical records from that night. I read the official rescue report that described the unusual animal tracks around his location, and I called the sanctuary. Ghost escaped from its enclosure 3 days before Marcus's accident. The sanctuary staff searched for days, but never found any sign of the tiger. Some animals, when they escape captivity, head for familiar territory. And the mountains of Montana, the same mountains where Ghost had nearly died as a cub, were apparently still somewhere in its memory. Ghost was never recaptured. It's still out there. So what do we make of all this? I've been thinking about that question ever since I finished researching this story, and honestly, I still don't have a complete answer. Science tells us that animals don't form memories the way humans do. that they don't feel gratitude or loyalty in the way we understand those concepts. But science also can't fully explain why a tiger that had been living in a sanctuary for 4 years would escape, travel hundreds of miles through brutal terrain, and end up in the exact same mountain range where it was rescued as a cub. Coincidence is one explanation, but it's not a very satisfying one. What we know about animal cognition is constantly evolving. Studies on elephants, dolphins, and great apes have shown that these creatures form complex emotional bonds, remember individuals for decades, and exhibit behaviors that look remarkably like what we'd call gratitude or mourning in humans. Big cats are less studied in this regard, but that doesn't mean they're incapable of similar connections. Maybe Ghost didn't consciously decide to save Marcus. Maybe it was just instinct, seeking warmth, finding a familiar scent. But maybe, just maybe, something deeper was happening that night, something we don't have the vocabulary to describe yet. Ghost has been spotted twice more in the Montana wilderness since that night in January 2023. Both sightings were brief, reported by hikers who caught glimpses of a large white shape moving through the trees. Wildlife officials have discussed recapture attempts, but so far nothing has been done. The terrain is too difficult, the tiger too elusive, and frankly, the resources required would be enormous. There's also an ethical question that no one seems eager to answer. Ghost spent years in captivity, first with traffickers, then in a rescue sanctuary. Now it's living free, surviving on its own in a landscape that shouldn't support a tiger, but somehow does. Is recapturing it really the right thing to do? Marcus doesn't think so. When I asked him about the recapture debate, he was quiet for a long moment before answering. He said that Ghost had already been through enough. Taken from its mother, abandoned to die, rescued, rehabilitated, transferred, confined. The tiger had spent its entire life having its fate decided by humans, and now, for the first time, it was making its own choices, living on its own terms. Marcus said he couldn't support taking that away, even if it meant Ghost faced dangers in the wild. Some things deserve to be free, he told me. Even if it's harder, even if it's riskier, some things just deserve to be free. I asked Marcus what Ghost had taught him, and his answer surprised me. He didn't talk about animal behavior or survival instincts or anything scientific. He talked about presence, about showing up. He said that on the worst night of his life, when he was injured and freezing and completely alone, something showed up for him. Not because it had to, not because there was any reward in it, but just because it did. And that changed how he thinks about everything, about the connections we form, about the debts we owe, about what it means to really be there for another living being. Ghost didn't just save his life that night. Ghost changed how he understands life itself. I don't know if Ghost knew it was saving the man who saved it. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Animal minds are still largely a mystery to us, and I'm not going to pretend I have answers that scientists don't. But I know this much. On that mountain, on that freezing night, two beings who had nothing in common found each other again, and one of them survived because of it. Again. That's not a coincidence. That's not random chance. That's something else, something I don't have a word for. But I think we all recognize it when we see it. I think that's why this story won't let go of me. And I suspect it won't let go of you either. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. I've got more cases like this coming. Stories of animals and humans crossing paths in ways that don't make sense until they suddenly do. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think happened that night. Was it instinct? Memory? Something more? I read every comment, and I genuinely want to know your perspective. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and maybe take a moment to appreciate the connections in your life that you can't quite explain. They might matter more than you think.